and you're listening to A Little Too Quiet, the Ferndale Library podcast, brought to you by the Friends of the Ferndale Library. My name is Jeff Milo, and joining me on the podcast today is Peter Markus. We are going to be talking about his first book of poetry. He's the author of 6 books of fiction, but When Our Fathers Return to Us as Birds is his first formal collection of poetry out on Wayne State University Press. We're going to be talking a lot about poems, and we're going to be talking a lot about the grieving process. These poems were written as Peter Markus was preparing for the death of his father, and then some written after his father had passed. And these aren't easy conversations to have, and these very much are not easy poems to write. But throughout these more than 90 poems, Markus is tuning his eye and ear towards a new world, a world where a father's slow dying process and eventual death leads the writer, the son, to take a walk outside, to, quote, meet my shadow in the deepening shade, and perhaps find this broader existential dialogue with the natural world. In these poems, Markus, as a son, is simultaneously caring for his dying father, losing the father, and then finding his dead father in the trees and the water and the sky. And he is listening to the birds and to the fish, and also thinking about and listening to this river that runs beside his house, this river that separates his parents' house from the view of this shut down steel mill, and just ruminating on this sentence, my father is dying in a house across the river. But as a reader, these poems just reminded me to be so much more receptive to the natural world, and to really start thinking about how we honor the memory of our loved ones, and how we can even honor them while they are still here and not have to wait until they are gone. Peter Markus is the senior writer with InsideOut Literary Arts here in Detroit, and is on the faculty at Oakland University, where he teaches creative writing. And he is also the author of 6 books of fiction, including The Fish and Not the Fish, which was named a Michigan Notable Book in 2015. We talk a lot about the work of InsideOut Literary Arts, which is also detailed in the pages of a book that Markus co-edited with Terry Blackhawk, titled To Light a Fire, 20 Years with the InsideOut Literary Arts Project. And that is a long-running, unique, school-based writer-in-residence program which places professional writers in classrooms to engage students in the power of the literary arts, and that includes poetry. And we talk a lot about that with Peter Markus, and we especially talk about his powerful poetry in When Our Fathers Return to Us as Birds. Here's our chat. I've been talking to lots of poets on this podcast, whether it was, John Freeman or Joy Keynes Friedler. I find myself inching closer and closer to saying, isn't poetry so important and necessary, and people can use it to process their emotions, and it serves such a purpose, and I tend to loft it up and up as being so important. But reading your book and how it is really tied into the grieving process, and then looking at your past with InsideOut, maybe that resonates with you. Maybe that idea of writing being useful resonates with you. And I'd love to just kind of start there to get your thoughts on that, because I know you've written on how writing can be very transformative for whoever takes on the exercise.
Yeah, I think that's a great entry point, Jeff, especially specifically with this last book, or this new book of mine, which, unlike maybe my previous books, or at least unlike especially my fiction, I do feel like this book might be of use to the reader, and even maybe the general reader. As poets, you tend to loft it up within the academy itself, which of course poetry lives vibrantly there. But I don't think that this book aims to necessarily placate that particular reader. And in writing these poems, more than anything else, I really wanted to, number one, to serve the purpose to me, to help me process what I was seeing and hearing and feeling as it related to my father's illness. And then I wasn't necessarily thinking about this as I was writing the poems, but maybe more so than ever before, I was saying, well, maybe if these poems in the process of writing is helping to serve me as a writer, it might actually serve the reader in some capacity as well. And from what I've heard from some readers is that it's certainly, whether or not the particulars of their grief had to do with an aging parent or a spouse or even a child, that maybe grief is universal in the way that love and loss is. Whereas my fiction was me just, playing around with language and just trying to be inventive more than anything else. This was definitely a new lane for me to drive the car in, so to speak.
Sure. And I think that's what I was wondering, what as a lifelong writer and an educator of young aspiring writers, are we being a little overzealous in saying that poetry has to serve this serious role in our lives, I guess, because I think technically it can also be for fun, but when you have, I guess, fiction, you have the characters to focus on, you have themes that you can play with. A poem is just usually one page, and it's so raw, and it feels like it has to be urgent. And maybe I was hoping you could enlighten me as the educator and me as just the reader.
I don't know. I mean, I think, when I do teach poems, which I do all the time, whether or not it's with InsideOut and working with third graders in East Dearborn or fifth graders on the southwest side of Detroit, or, I've worked in K through 12 classrooms for over 2 decades. Yeah. Sometimes poems might invite even the younger reader to go into serious places, but that's certainly not the entry point that I try to offer them, the access to a poem. So I tend to begin in a more playful, surreal place, I guess, for lack of a better word, a space where it just invites, especially the young writer, to just enter into a creative room where anything's possible, and we're really just sort of making something out of nothing. So for instance, like most recently with my students this year, I've brought in a line from the poet and the famous novelist and writer and Jim Harrison, who says, to write a poem, you must first create a pen to write what you want to say. So just, like, hey, well, even though our pens and our pencils are good at doing math and just the general writing that you might be doing, for school, I just sort of say, let's create this pen or this pencil. And if we could create a pencil that could serve other purposes, even beyond our own interest in writing a poem, what might that pencil look like? So it's a very sort of like good first step in saying, well, you mean this pencil can do anything? And I say, yeah, the pencil can do anything. What would you want it to do? And then once they break through that wall of, maybe there is some resistance when most people are tasked to write a poem, this is a very sort of undangerous sort of territory to begin with. And it's just simply not even, writing the poem itself, but just creating the pencil, which is a nice first step. And I think it could work. Certainly I've done similar things with my college students at Oakland University. And, again, anytime I run into a room of any students, whether or not they're third graders or college students, or even I've done some workshops of late at the Hannon House in Detroit with senior citizens, I think it's good to just open the door initially in a very carefree way that will sort of not be as daunting, not so lofty, not so intimidating, because I really do think that a poem is something that anyone is capable of doing, and I really believe that. And I wouldn't be a teacher if I didn't believe that.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, I run into people and students all the time who don't believe that. And one of my jobs early on is to get them to believe in their own creativity,
Mm-hmm.
to believe in their own voice, to believe in their own power of the imagination, and also to realize that their poems are sort of right there in their own backyard, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to necessarily move beyond your own neighborhood to find that there is plenty to report upon.
Mm-hmm. I feel like I want to be candid with you, and I feel like a lot of readers will find a lot of resonance in this book depending on where they are in their lives. And it's not like they're probably not going to listen to this podcast, so I have no problem talking about my own parents, but I have entered into becoming a caregiver for them. So these poems are hitting me possibly harder. So my mind is on a lot of things you're touching on here. And there's more than 90 poems in here. Some of them are in stages where you are anticipating the passing, and then some are after the fact. And what I especially appreciate about your poems is this connection to and this listening to of nature. And I want to get to that, but if I'm anticipating the grief that I might have to withstand, I interpret that as my instinct might be to go inward, to stay in the room and close the blinds and turn the lights off. And I think that I'm looking at my own backyard differently. I'm looking at birds differently. I'm looking at the blue sky differently, almost in anticipation of that loss, and just looking at that bigger world, listening to that bigger world. So I want to start there, and I would just want to start, if you could tell us, the title is When Our Fathers Return to Us as Birds. Could you maybe contextualize how important nature has been? It's been there in your books before, whether it was fish or it was mud or what have you. And there's a lot of walks through the woods. There's a lot of fishing here. There's a line in a poem that really, really hit me, that you would maybe used to be listening to the fish to know where to, not the fish, listening to the birds to know where to go. Now you're opening your ears to them in a different way. Can you talk about that as your way of getting through this? Just being in nature, listening to nature.
Yeah, you bet. I mean, first off, I'm sorry to hear that your parents are getting to that point where they need your attentions.
But it's like, it's all eventual. We all going to be there. Yeah.
I mean, if you live a long enough time, you're going to be lucky enough to be put into that position of doing for them what they did for us.
Absolutely.
So it really is, it will always be a privilege and an honor that I was able to be present in the way that I was. And by making myself available and present to that difficult subject matter of seeing my father, bedridden and unable to do just the basic things that brought him joy, like, going for a walk and walking down to the river and tinkering with his boats. It's sort of, the torch got passed to me in that regard. So I really started to just feel real pure, unadulterated gratitude for being able to do those things through the lens of what he could not. And so, when I would, let's say, move outside or into the backyard, or, move down to the river and just to get a breath of fresh air, and just to still see that there was great abundance all around me. That was really the great lesson that I was sort of wanting at that point, for my father to be able to live vicariously through me. And so, before I was, as you pointed out in my other books, sure, there was always a river running through it, and there were fish and in the mud, and even the steel mill. And there's that familiar landscape that I built that world of my books from that the particulars of that real world. In my fiction, it's sort of, it's those things are more words for me than anything else. I don't know if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But in these poems, the birds and the fish in the river and even the shipwrecked or abandoned steel mill across the river from where my parents lived and still live, those were actual things in these poems. So I wasn't making anything up. I was just simply looking around and paying attention and being astonished, to use the words of Mary Oliver, by what I was seeing, and then to tell about it and to try to do so as honestly as I could, and also as truthful as I could, so that other people, whether or not they're dealing with, like you are, your own set of aging parents, or people who just, again, loss is everywhere. If we love a thing, we know that eventually we're going to lose it. And I think, and I hope that poems, we often reach for those books of poems to help us through those hard times. It's Rethke's directive, in a dark time, the eye begins to see. So that was part of my process, is just sort of, waking up, as my father always did during his many years of his working life, at 5 a.m. And I just sort of entered that ritual with him. And, I like to begin my day, even to this day, with poetry before anything else, before I check my emails, before I go on Facebook and all those things that unfortunately we do in the year 2021. I like to turn to the old pages of other poets who really helped and guided me through the writing of this book.
Yeah.
Those poems helped me find my own poems. And like I said, like they were right there across the river, and I didn't have to go far to get to them. And same thing I tell my students, it's like, we don't have to, it's the accessibility of a poem is one of its great attractions. And I think even to the point when culturally something major happens, whether or not it's 9/11 or president being assassinated, or, a pandemic, or whatever we might be collectively moving through, I'm always moved by the fact that, writers and even non-writers are moved either to reach for poems or to write their own even.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that just speaks to the purity of a poem, and the fact that if you really look at most poems that are written, in the past, let's just call it 50 years even, there's really nothing all that too academic about them, except for the fact that the way that most of us were first taught poetry was in that academic way, which can, turn people away from the act of writing their own poems. So my approach always is like a poem is something that is here for you, and don't think you can't do it, because you can.
Yeah.
I can't sit down in front of a piano, right, and do what great musicians are able to do. I can't pick up a guitar and I might be able to hit a few chords, but like I just, my hands don't do that. Right. And I'm sure that there's certain students who might say to me, my hands don't do that either with a poem. But I think you can get to that C chord a lot easier in a poem than maybe on a guitar or on a piano. And of course, it's easy just to hit that chord maybe, but I'll tell you, I could grab my guitar right now and try to play a C, and it would still be muted,
Right,
it
right.
still wouldn't be the way that all the musicians that you revere, the way that they can do it. So I'm like, Elliott Smith or something, his hands were capable of doing things that only the hands of maybe great poets are able to do. And sure, there's some great poets out there who can do this dance with language in a way that, even I would sort of say, oh yeah, that's not my thing.
Sure.
But we all got our own thing. And poetry at its most basic level, I think, is just one of the maybe most human things that, sort of can help us to remain human.
Sure. I think I would love to ruminate on this really important and intimate exchange that goes on between a reader and, since I have you here, you specifically really here, if you're putting down these poems, and just to kind of to go off on that music tangent for a moment, we will listen to, whether it is Elliott Smith or if it's Joni Mitchell, we'll listen to these songwriters, these real troubadours, and part of our admiration for them, resulting in after we experience their art, is this appreciation for how eloquent they were, for how willing to be vulnerable they were, and then we absorb that, and I think that we find inspiration in that. Like Joni found these words, Elliott found these words, and they put it this way. Maybe I can write a song, not necessarily a song. Maybe I'll put my thoughts down. They found this way to put their thoughts down. Maybe I feel inspired now because they did it in such an elegant way. And if you listen to a rock band because it makes you feel cool, or you listen to a disco record because it makes you want to dance, but you listen to these more poetic musicians that I'm riffing on because they make you want to pour your heart out. And maybe that is part of a reason why we'll read poetry and why we read your book, is that your willingness to be vulnerable and the words you find, I'll absorb that, and then now I will be inspired to write my words about my parents. And I don't know if that comes up so much in the role of being the educator, but I think it's something worth appreciating. I don't have a question there. I just wanted to throw that at you.
Yeah, no, I mean, if someone does, after reading this book, pick up a pencil, to me, that's maybe the greatest achievement that could take place, knowing that.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly, if someone just reads it and comes away feeling something that maybe this book maybe, makes them consider their own past or present or possibly even future, again, that would be part of the book's achievement, in the very least. And it's hard to teach vulnerability, and it gets back to even going back to your opening comments of the poems, sort of the way we elevate poetry as maybe even in a way that maybe we should try to ground it more in the everyday. But I mean, vulnerability is hard to teach. But to me, the best poems, and I see this in my own students, especially the older ones, when they write something where I'll say to them, this is a poem that needed to be written. And that speaks volumes, as opposed to them just sort of doing the assignment, so to speak, but when, and that's maybe the gift that comes with time, that, it took me to my mid-50s in order for me to be made to be open to my own vulnerability. And maybe that's why I wrote this as a book of poems as opposed to a book of fiction.
Sure.
And I don't know that my books of fiction necessarily would be called out for their vulnerability, and maybe that's the difference in this sort of my own evolution and my even becoming at the middle part of my life a poet, to the point where I've sort of lost interest in making things up, at least for the past 4 or 5 years. And I'm still writing poems now and not fiction, So I don't know. I guess you turn the page and
Sure.
you sort of take what's given and you make with it.
Yeah. And that enters the territory of what is it that we find fulfilling? Is poetry fulfilling us? Let's continue following that. That is fulfilling. But I mentioned being really open and observant to nature. You're also as you're going through it, as you're writing these poems, I think that you're observant of your own self. Can you talk about that? Because I believe that you, for a few poems, you will go into third person as though you're outside of yourself. What was that like, and what motivated that decision, I guess, creatively?
Yeah, there's a few poems, or maybe more than a few, where I definitely abandon first person and decide to just switch over to third person, just to see how that might open up the powers of observation, maybe more than anything else. So for me, it just gave me a little bit of maybe psychic and distance from that vulnerability. Because one of the risks of being vulnerable is being sentimental. And I know that I'm risking sentimentality in this book with every poem. But I really feel that that's what good poems do, is that they really sort of straddle that line between that raw emotion and the emotion that becomes sentimental or maudlin or whatever the word might be. And I think that poetry can actually, I wish there were more poems that were more sentimental than they are. A lot of times we're taught to be sort of coldly detached from our emotions and to be more in the mind than anything else. And as much as I love a poet like Wallace Stevens for that reason, I really am more drawn to writers that I think, speak more directly about, the places that love and loss and grief and joy might take us.
Yeah. You run that gamut in this book. There could be a poem about even just the electricity that you experience when your fingertips touch the skulls of small dead animals, for a start. And then we can go straight to the raw surface with one of my favorite poems. And now I'm wondering if you would interpret it as traipsing close to sentimentality, but I just could not help but bring up the poem, I'm Afraid I'm Going to Forget. And that, which, given the nature of the book, and if anyone, I think anyone can maybe fill in the blanks as to where you're going to go with that poem, and you do go there with that poem. But I think that you also do write beautifully about why we keep writing poems, or why we even just keep writing. It's that sense of, I think, not even just exorcising the grief, but coming to more of an enlightenment about the person we're grieving. We maybe saw them every day of our lives, but did we, I guess, come to terms with how much we actually knew them and all of that? But I'm prattling on again, Peter, but that's a really powerful poem for me. So, and I love how direct it is. And I think it's a really valuable, it's a valuable poem. Maybe that's not the term I want to use, but I think it is. What do you think?
No, I appreciate you saying all that. And I would hope that others might also feel that, like I do, that, when we write about those difficult things, I think our first impulse when we're asked to do hard things is to resist and to look away. And I think in that poem, there's this idea that, I'm writing to become more present, right? I don't want to forget this. And so I'm going to look closer while I can.
Yeah.
And so that, by looking, it just sort of leaves this this lasting mark on my memory, and so that I don't forget. And I haven't forgotten.
Yeah.
And it's why I'm still writing through the process, even, 3.5 years later. It's still very present to me. This is probably the first conversation I've had about the book and my father that I haven't had to put the conversation on mute, because it's not easy for me to articulate, and that sort of also speaks to the power of writing. Like, I'm not a very public person. Like, I'm not forthcoming with colleagues and friends about, what I'm feeling. I'm not that guy, which is maybe why, in the quiet of my own personal space, I was able to access some very private material and very private emotions. But, it just gets back to like, what is that story that we are given that we can then make something true with? Again, having to witness and see my father in a new light, and to watch that struggle was something that I really wanted to honor and, again, pay close attention to, even though I wanted to look away at times, and I wanted to forget, and I just wanted to drive away, and I just wanted to jump into the river, just escape. But I think it's, maybe the poems taught me to be braver than I thought I could be, and to be tougher, and to teach me that, you can do this, like you can be a good son.
Yeah. And that word honor really, really, really resonates with me. Honoring this person who was here. We think of big stone monuments in a cemetery, and that just seems like it's a cold gesture. But finding words to, I think that writing about someone, and I don't certainly want to go into sentimentality, but obviously writing about them gives them that immortality on the page. They were here, we're remembering them, very much honoring them, and I do think that that's a great note to end on when we say that this writing is hard to do. This kind of thing is hard to go through, but that the writing can, I think, also make us stronger, and perhaps hopefully stronger than we thought we were. So I mentioned early in the podcast that I'm where I am in my life with my loved ones, but however scary this is to say out loud for some to hear, we're all going to be there one day, and I think that's important to remember. And so I think that these are really beautiful poems in that way for us to interact with now, just to get us thinking about it. And you get to the end of this book, as you hopefully do when you get to the end of all good poetry, and you just feel an appreciation for the writer being able to just do it. Those thoughts might be in your head, they might be in your heart, but then the formulation of them and sitting with them, and then that willingness to be vulnerable on a page and put it in a book is just wonderful. So I want to thank you for writing this, Peter. That's all. It's made me want to write. So
thank you for your appreciation. Thank you for reading it. And, hopefully, as you were speaking, Jeff, I was just thinking about some words that Raymond Carver wrote in an essay quoting Saint Teresa from, 700 years ago. And she said something to the effect that, words are deeds, they prepare the soul and get it ready to move toward tenderness, So if this book, as the words that they are, can prepare you for your own good deeds and your own ability to serve in whatever way that you might, and to be present for your own father and mother and whoever else needs you, then I've done my job here. I can say that with a great big smile on my face.
Absolutely. An invocation, and the reader leaves the book feeling we can never be fully ready, but we are readier. If that's, hopefully I didn't mangle English there. We are more ready. So I am at least a bit more ready. So thank you so much, Peter Markus.
Thank you, Jeff.
And that was our chat with Peter Markus. He is the author of many books, including the very recent collection of poetry, When Our Fathers Return to Us as Birds. And I would encourage you to read it, because just like you could likely find lots of comfort and even kinship with Markus and his experience, and hopefully you can find resonance in these words to maybe what you are yourself going through, and maybe it inspires you to write something down. And that's what it's all about. We should all just be writing these things down. It's very transformative. That is it for our episode and our chat with Peter Markus. We thank him again for being here, and we thank you for listening to A Little Too Quiet. It's the Ferndale Library podcast, and it's brought to you by the Friends of the Ferndale Library. The music that you hear at the beginning and end of each episode is by a local musician known as Zunset. If you want to support this podcast, you could go to ferndalefriends.org, or you could leave a review or like us or follow us, leave a comment, that could help us find more listeners, or you could just tell a friend about this show. And if you especially liked this episode, please share it to social media. We'll be back next week with more. Thanks for listening.